Gospel reading this evening is from the Gospel of John. There were some Greeks in town who had come up to worship at the feast. They approached Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee. "Sir, we want to see Jesus. Can you help us?" Philip went and told Andrew. Andrew and Philip together told Jesus. Jesus answered, "Time's up. The time has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Listen carefully. Unless a grain of wheat is buried in the ground, dead to the world, it is never any more than a grain of wheat. But if it is buried, it sprouts and reproduces itself many times over. In the same way, anyone who holds on to life just as it is, destroys that life. But if you let it go, reckless in your love, you'll have it forever, real and eternal. If any of you want to serve me, then follow me. Then you'll be where I am, ready to serve at a moment's notice. The Father will honor and reward anyone who serves me. Right now I am shaken, and what am I going to say? Father, get me out of this? No, this is why I came in the first place. I'll say, Father, put your glory on display. A voice came out of the sky. I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again. The listening crowd said, thunder. Others said, an angel spoke to him. Jesus said, the voice didn't come for me, but for you. At this moment, the world is in crisis. Now Satan, the ruler of this world, will be thrown out. And I, as I am lifted up from the earth, will attract everyone to me and together around me. He put it this way to show how he was going to be put to death. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. So welcome to the fifth Sunday of Lent and the continuation and the culmination of the Lenten message theme of promises, God's promise to us and our promises to God. And today is a really good day to talk about biblical covenants, since our first lesson is about old and new covenants. In secular lingo, a covenant is an agreement between two people. In a biblical covenant, it is more than an agreement, it is a promise of God. Many times it's conditional to the ancient Israelites to be their God if they kept God's laws and were faithful. In that time, covenants were serious business. Typically, if two people would make a covenant with one another, make a promise to each other, they would sacrifice an animal and then cut the animal in two. And it was to symbolize if either of them broke the promise, then they would be cut in two as well. And this idea of a sacrifice went forward into the future, and you're pretty well aware of that, I'm sure, because anytime the ancient Israelites before Jesus would have sin or misdeeds, they would have an animal sacrifice, especially if the sin or the misdeeds were against God. Now, God made several covenants in the course of the Old Testament, and some of them I just want to kind of go over them really quickly. The first one was sort of implied, but it was the one with the Garden of Eden, the Garden of Paradise. Adam and Eve were in the garden, and God promised if you didn't eat of this fruit, then you could stay in paradise forever. And then Noah, there was the promise that that God would never destroy the earth again by water, and the rainbow was set in the sky to as a sign for that. And then you're familiar with the covenant with Abraham, that even though he was old and hadn't had any babies, God promised that his descendants would be like the sands on the beaches. There would just be, you couldn't count them. And God fulfilled that promise, actually. That's happened. And then the fourth covenant or fourth promise that God made to the people of Israel was the one from Moses. And it actually was a renewal of Abraham's covenant. Moses went up on Mount Sinai and God gave him 10 commandments and he brought them down. And so this was the Mosaic Covenant, was the covenant of the law. The fifth covenant was the priestly covenant, and that was the promise that God made to Aaron that his descendants would all be priests. And then the last one was the Davidic covenant, or the covenant of King David, that the lineage of King David would go forth. And so there would be all these kings that would come from King David. And we hear that story at Christmas when we hear that Joseph was of the line of David. And so therefore Jesus is a king. Throughout this season of Lent, this season that we've talked about promises, we've talked about various stories from these covenants or promises of God that God made to God's people. But the Mosaic covenant, or the covenant of Moses, the promise that we talk about with Moses, is typically what we think of when we talk about the old covenant, the covenant of the rules and the laws. And if we look in Deuteronomy, we can see that God has, through Moses, set up a law for the Israelite people to follow, or laws. And so as long as they do, God will protect them and God will provide for them. This law was written on stone tablets and kept in the Ark of the Covenant, and a priestly hierarchical system from the tribe of Levi was set up for the people to communicate with God and to seek forgiveness via sacrifices and other offerings. Today in the reading from the prophet Jeremiah, we hear God say he's ready to do away with the old promise or the old covenant. And he promises Jeremiah that someday God will give us a new covenant. Now, Jeremiah is writing in the context of trying to gather God's people and get them on the straight and narrow. So this conversation that he has with God is basically sort of a comfort to Jeremiah, because in Jeremiah's time, what has happened is, and I'll kind of go back a little bit, the kingdom of Israel was divided into two. There was a northern kingdom and there was a southern kingdom, and Israel was the northern kingdom, and their people acted all away from God and did things that really messed up, and they were overtaken by the Assyrians, and so that kingdom was no more. Jeremiah is in Judah, which is where Jerusalem is, and all the people are not obeying God and doing all kinds of terrible things, and Jeremiah is going around as a prophet trying to get them straightened out. God's comforting word to Jeremiah that there would be a new covenant comes before the Babylonians actually sacked Jerusalem and tore down the temple, Solomon's temple. And actually at that point was the last time we ever hear about the Ark of the Covenant, or the covenant that, the 10 Commandments, because everything was destroyed. And the people that survived that were taken off to Babylon in exile for a period of years. So in this passage of Jeremiah, the prophet's been trying to get the people to obey God. Then God makes a new promise, and he declares that one day, not this day, but one day, there would come a new covenant. And this covenant would not be written on stone tablets, as Moses did, but in the minds and the hearts of those who would follow him. This covenant promises to be a more personal kind of covenant, not full of rituals and not full of hierarchical priesthoods, but one in which each person can know God directly and be forgiven of their sins directly. Jeremiah prophesies of God's desires and God's ability to wipe the slate clean and to come to each person even closer than before in the form of the new covenant with God's people. God and God's people were already close. I mean, the whole Old Testament is a story of God and God's people and their relationship with each other all the way down through history. And so they were already close, but God promises to be even closer, to forgive and forge even a more profound unity and intimacy with God's people. Over and over throughout history, the children of Israel and us, and and all the way down to us, receive the gift of divine forgiveness. And it culminates in the new covenant manifested in Jesus. Christopher McLeod writes, what are the promises that are made, the predictions of the new Messiah of Jesus, made by God and the prophets? And he collects these verses from the Old Testament. And this is from Isaiah. His spirit, his presence will never leave us. And from Joel and Jeremiah, God will be so near to us that we will not depend on other holy leaders such as Moses to hear his voice and heed his teachings. And in Ezekiel, we hear that he will cleanse us, he will heal us, he will give us a new heart. And again, his spirit, we will have his spirit. And that will cause us to move according to his will and his teaching. And then another passage from Ezekiel says, his new covenant will be eternal, and God will dwell among God's people. So we have the old promise, the covenant that's based on the laws and the rules, replaced with a new covenant or promise based on the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. We hear in the New Testament a number of passages that talk about the difference between the old covenant and the new covenant, or the old promise and the new promise from God. In Galatians, the old covenant exposes sin, while Romans says the new covenant covers sin. The old covenant cannot give life, from 2 Corinthians, the old covenant cannot give life, but the new covenant does give life. The old covenant was abolished while the new covenant is in force. The old covenant brings a curse while the new covenant redeems from the curse. In the old covenant, you lived by your works, while in the new covenant, living is by faith. In the gospel appointed for today, Jesus plants the image of the seed dying to self, planted in the ground, and then growing up and coming into its full ultimate life and bearing much fruit. And he says this as a metaphor for his own crucifixion and being lifted up on our behalf. The connection point between the two lessons is that they are deeply in service of each other. Jeremiah tells us that God will come closer to us than a husband and wife, directly into our hearts. Deep in the mystery, we will be known by God, truly known even beyond our fear of being known, and we will be forgiven and we will be loved. Jesus then promises that through his life in us, we will be drawn into a similar emptying out or dying to self, so that we might share God's love and forgiveness with others, so that others can also know the joy and the relief of being known and loved. In this way, we are following Jesus, and in following Jesus, this leads to our mission. It leads to our mission. This is the new covenant. This is the new covenant. Promises, promises. Our Holy Communion prayer echoes the words, "This is my body that is for you." This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Not your blood, not my blood, not the blood of a sacrificial animal, but Jesus' blood. And he says, remember me, remember me. And here we are at the end of the message series on promises, God's promises to us, living in and ready to experience and receive the new covenant. Nearing the end of Lent and beginning the Holy Week next week with Palm and Passion Sunday. Then we will experience the great 3 days of Easter, Maundy, Thursday, Good Friday, and the Feast of the Resurrection. We have been given divine forgiveness. We've been called for reconciliation with God beyond our imagination, that God lives in our hearts through Jesus Christ. And we're called to mission because we're followers of Jesus. We're living into the new covenant. So what do we promise in response to this incredible love? I invite you to reflect on your promise or your promises to God as we enter this most holy time of the Christian year. As we move into Holy Week, what is your promise? What is your promise to God? And I think we will move right into the conversation